underneath her peplum, this little ruffly thing is called a peplum, we can see what's happening to the actual self skirt. Okay, so what's happening is we've got a little additional curved piece that has even more fullness than the flare skirt itself. So do you see how if I flatten out the flare skirt, the ruffle has even more dimension. Plus, we know we added 7 bits of flare up here, and we need to add the same amount into the back so that the skirt is sort of balanced still. So we're going to take the back, so ignore the peplum, that's the last thing that we're going to do today. And we're going to chop the skirt up into 3 pieces. The top piece is going to be a little triangle that's between the triangle and the second piece is where the peplum is going to be sandwiched into. So we need a place for that peplum to go. So that'll ultimately go in that angle. And then we need to chop off a bottom area that we will then flare just like we flared the godet. So let's do it. So I've got my back piece. I've added the little 1/2 inch at the bottom so that the self is longer than the lining. And I've measured down center back to find where this point is going to be. But as I'm doing this, I have to keep in mind that this pattern piece already has seam allowance. Often we're just tracing from a sloper and it doesn't have seam allowance and we can just chop it up. But since we traced from an existing pattern that already had seam allowance, we need to know where some of these intersections are. So what I've done here is I've measured in 1/2 inch and down 1/2 inch to find that center back waist corner here. And I've done the same thing at the side seam to find out where the back side seam intersection is. I need to know where those corners are so I can do some more accurate measurements. So I'm going to start off by making the triangular piece, and I'm going to measure down from the actual center back waist, not the cut edge, not the seam allowance edge. So this is center back waist, and I may as well label this is center back, and down here this is center back. I know I'm going to be chopping this up 3 times, so I may as well label center back 3 times. And while you're at it, you could draw that center back line all the way down if you want to, and put CBs in the different little 3 sections. So we're going to make our triangular piece 5.5 inches finished. So you've got to measure down, don't include seam allowance. So from this marked area, I'm going to measure down 5.5 inches, and I'm going to put a mark to know that's where the point of my triangle is. This triangle is going to finish at nothing at this side back intersection. Once I've got those 2 marks, I can just connect them with a straight line.
Can I just clarify that it was 5.5 inches?
5.5.
From?
I've got it written on the board.
Oh, from the edge.
From this, it finishes 5.5. It finishes 5.5. So this will go away if you sew it.
And then that's
5.5 finished.
Oh,
so finished. After it's sewn, we want it to measure 5.5.
Okay.
So that's why I marked where that corner is, so I could measure from that mark. And when I connect it to 0, 0 is not the corner of the paper. 0 at the waist is that 1/2 inch intersection there.
Not including the seam allowance.
Correct. No, know where your seam allowance is. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this off. I'm actually going to extend the line all the way. Now, this is about the time when we need to start thinking about the direction seams are going to be pressed. We haven't had to worry about it too much up until now because most of our intersections have been right angles or very close to being right angles. Now that I've got an intersection that's very, very pointy, I need to think about how this is going to be pressed as far as seam allowance goes. So I have seam allowance that is accurately sized to fit those locations. So So we're going to go back to our little teaching sample here. I think sometimes the best way to figure out how something is made is to look at something made the way you want to do it. Especially until you've got a lot of experience, use somebody else's idea, right? So if I look at this, I see some stitching here. This is letting me know that this seam allowance has been folded up, okay? When I actually, and I was like, huh, why did they do that? When I actually started sewing it, this circular piece that I had to slash, it ended up making sense for it to go up. It wanted to go up, so I guess she let it go up and has secured it and supported it with some stitching. So we're going to be planning on having this seam allowance on this piece be pressed up. So how is that going to work? So you'll put your brown paper, or your piece on 2 layers of brown paper, because this is a cut 2. We know we already have seam allowance here. We know we already have seam allowance here. I need to add 1/2-inch seam allowance along the piece that I just cut. Okay? And then, before I cut out the piece, I can cut along that 1/2-inch line, but I'm then going to fold my seam allowance up as if I had just sewn it. And then I'm going to cut the side seam in this other little part. That will give me these great little angles, kind of like how we fold our darts before we cut. If you know you're going to be folding seam allowance in a certain direction, fold your seam allowance and then cut. If you had a squared intersection like down here, it's squared off. You don't need to worry about folding it, because if you fold a square to a square, it should still match. Worry about that kind of thing when you've got really steep corners, okay? So that's this piece. The only thing you really have to worry about there is that little fold to make sure you've got a corner here. And then you get a little bit of a corner up here as well. Okay. Now, down here, we've got to draft a curve. And I think it looks especially nice and symmetrical if you've got an angle in one direction and you've got an angle happening in the other direction. It's kind of nice when they're the same angle. So what I like to do before I mount this on brown paper is I like to take this angled piece that was like this, and I like to flip it down and use that angle to start tracing off the first portion of my curve. That just, your eyes will just see it and go, oh, that's harmonious. Whereas if it's off, it just might look a little off balanced. So whenever possible, if you've got angles, it's nice to kind of make a match. And I don't need a protractor or anything to do it this way. I've got a little piece. I can just put it down. So how high up are we going to go? Well, I measured Miss Anna Sui, and she went up 12 inches. So from the finished edge, measure up 12 inches and put a mark. Now notice how I put my mark on the center back line. I didn't put it on the cut edge. I put it on the center back line. I want to have it finish on the center back line at 12 inches. And then I'm going to put my little piece down. And I'm just going to give myself an indication of an angle. It's really hard, I think, to trace dot paper. It's another reason why we put it on brown paper, because it's a lot easier to trace. So if I just put a few marks on here, I can connect those dots with a ruler. If I move this away. Okay, so I've started myself with an angle. And that way it's a nice reflected kind of thing. On the side seam, we're going to go up 6.5 inches. So this flounce is kind of a ruffle that doesn't have gathers. So this flounce here is taller in the back and smaller on the side seam, and then we're going to have a nice gentle curve connecting on that. So at the side seam from the finished edge, I'm measuring up 6.5 inches, and I'm squaring out a little bit just so I don't have to worry about another strange angle there. And now this is where just your own aesthetic and some curves will help you out. I would just place some curves until you're sort of happy with what kind of curve you want to have. But kind of go for a partial circle. That's sort of what we're after. We don't want like straight, 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 and then a really sharp